Through the 1700s, through the 18th century, enslaved labor becomes vital in the British Empire to the production of commodity crops, crops like tobacco, and then after the American Revolution in particular, crops like cotton and rice and sugar. And slave labor is central to the production of these commodity crops because enslaved people are worked really to the point of death. And so the value of their labor in terms of their output is tremendous, right? That their labor is used and harnessed to generate tremendous profits through the production of commodity crops. First on the East Coast, on the Atlantic coast, with the North American colonies, right? So the production of tobacco, most notably in the Virginia colony, for example, right, booms with the use of enslaved labor.
Yeah, the extent to which the different regions of colonial America employed slave labor really depended on the climate and the crops they chose to grow. In New England, for example, it's very rocky. They have a short growing season because of the cold weather. So plantation agriculture just doesn't make sense there. You have much more small farms and people focused on trade, sailing ships that are transporting crops that other people have grown in the South, for example. In those middle colonies like Pennsylvania, New York, and then going further south, Maryland and Virginia, basically the further south you go, slavery becomes more and more important over time. And then in South Carolina and Georgia, you have even more large-scale plantation slavery because of the types of crops that can grow there, indigo and rice especially, are just very profitable. And so they can justify the kind of capital investment to own very large plantations with large numbers of slaves. And in South Carolina, the mortality rate is also a lot higher for slaves than in other regions for a combination of factors, how hard they're forced to work, the climate, the disease environment. And so because of that, they die off more quickly, but the crops are so profitable that it still makes economic sense to just import more and more slaves from Africa to replace those that die off. And that's even more true in the Caribbean, where slaves die off even faster. It's not uncommon for slaves to live less than 10 years after being brought from Africa, but the sugar they're producing in the Caribbean is so profitable that that still makes sense economically.
During the course of the 18th century, slavery developed in very different ways in different regions in North America. In the Carolinas, slaves largely worked under something called the task system. So if they were cultivating rice or indigo, they had a set task that they had to complete in a day. And after that task was completed, whether it was hoeing or weeding or anything else, their time was their own. So they could cultivate their own provisions, take care of their families, what have you. In the Chesapeake, the system was largely different, where they cultivated tobacco for the British home market. Slaves worked under what was called gang labor. So that meant they worked in groups under an overseer, and they worked for a set period of time instead. So they worked sunup to sundown, cultivating tobacco. So the different crops actually drove the development of two very different slave labor systems in the Carolina and the Virginias.
One of the things that's fascinating about the history of slavery in the United States is that we so often forget that slavery was central to many northern states, to the economic production in northern states, to the social relations and legal developments in the northern states as well as in the southern states. So in a place like New York State, for example, enslaved workers are used in agricultural pursuits across much of the state, especially in the Hudson River Valley, for instance. Enslaved workers produce food crops, whether it's fruit, apples, for example, other kinds of food commodity crops like corn, wheat, oats, all of this production of food that's sold locally and then sold to more distant markets, right? Sold to the Deep South, for example. Much of that production is done by enslaved workers, men, women, and children. There are also other industries in northern states as well as southern states that rely heavily on enslaved workers. The production of pottery, for example, the making of industrial vessels that are used for food storage, for storage of other materials, in other kinds of industrial production, leather manufacturing, iron manufacturing. Much of this in both northern states and southern states relies on the labor of enslaved workers.